YouTube stream. And we are live for another edition of Tech Talks. Thanks everybody for joining us. In this session, we are going to talk about extra credit assignments. First, we want to talk a little bit about, is there any research that supports or does not support the use of extra credit? Some ideas for like best practices of how to think about extra credit as a thing that you do in your class, if you choose to do that. And then we'll spend a little bit of time on the Canvas side of how do you enable extra credit in Canvas? Because it's not like the most intuitive process. There's different ways you can do it with pluses and minuses to them. So we'll try to get through some of those and hopefully with a minimum of confusion, because it's a little bit of a confusing process, but that's why we're here. Hey, Heather, thanks for joining us. Okay, so I'm going to share my screen because we just have a couple of slides. Oh, wait, where is it? Where's my slides? Oh, there we go. Okay. Share screen, slides, there we go. Okay, so as I was starting this process, I was trying to do a little bit of quick research on, is there anything in the literature that either supports or rejects the use of extra credit? And the thing that surprised me is there's not like a ton of experimental quantitative research about extra credit. There's a few studies here and there with small sample sizes, like one instructor did a thing in their class and measured the results, but there's not like a ton of really high quality data about it. What there is more of available is like survey data of faculty, their perceptions and whether they use extra credit or not. And those are also kind of mixed messages here. One survey of a group of, I think it was psychology faculty, found that 82% of responding faculty in that population use some form of extra credit. A different survey surveyed a more general population and found about 25% of faculty responding to that survey used extra credit. So it's kind of all over the map there, depending on who you ask, what surveys you look at, what data you try to find. Like I said, there are some survey studies out there of perceived advantages and disadvantages to extra credit among both faculty and students. Perceived advantages are extra credit can motivate some students to work harder. It can allow students to explore topics in greater detail. We'll talk about that a little bit more in a second. It can offer some flexibility or some grace for students that have emergencies come up, life events, they miss an assignment through no fault of their own. Extra credit can be a way to help them overcome those obstacles. And then students consistently report in any time they're surveyed about this, the great majority of students say they appreciate extra credit opportunities, especially they appreciate them because it feels like they get a second chance when they mess up, when they miss something or they bomb a test or whatever. Some perceived disadvantages from surveyed faculty are, and I think this one was also when students were asked this, is perceived as being unfair to offer extra credit only to select students. In other words, if you are just offering it to students that bombed the last test and not offering it to everybody, that's perceived as unfair, both by faculty and by students. There's a perception among some faculty that extra credit can encourage irresponsibility. You know, if a student thinks, oh, I don't need to study that hard because I'm going to have a ton of extra credit later in the quarter, that might encourage some students to not try as hard. There's a concern about inflating grades in the class, a concern about reducing the rigor of the course. And then there's also a perceived disadvantage that kind of makes sense intuitively. It's not necessarily productive to give additional work to a at-risk student if that student is not already mastering the fundamentals of the content, doesn't understand the basics. Giving them some kind of extra credit assignment on top of the stuff that they haven't already gotten done, probably not doing them any favors, is kind of how that was explained. Is there a comment in the chat?
Yeah, and Jennifer just chimed in with real tough to be rigorous enough, but have plenty of points to make the effort worthwhile. Jennifer, would you mind just kind of expanding on that a little bit? Are you kind of saying that you need to balance the amount of the extra credit points to the actual amount of points in the grade book total? Is that kind of the idea?
Yeah, you just so I run a 10-week quarter pretty much every quarter regardless of the season, and so there's always like an extra, I'm sorry, did I say quarter? I meant weeks. Like I run a 10-week quarter. Okay.
Yeah.
And so there's always that week where it's either a holiday or something else. And so I don't have anything else due that week, but I do have that extra credit opportunity. And, you know, I want it to be rigorous because I'd like for them to be able to learn something from it. But you also have to make it enough points that students will actually participate, because if it's not worth their time, they won't do it.
Yeah, totally.
And then again, you know, you ask yourself, okay, well then what's the effort in the class overall? But still, it's you know, you want to extend that olive branch, but it's not always accepted because it's too costly.
Sure.
Gotcha.
You're right. It's a balancing act. You know, what is rigorous enough to be worth it from the instructor's perspective? What's enough points to be worth it from the student's perspective? And how do you find the balance? It's the tough one. So there are a few studies that Nick and I found that did have a little bit of actual experimental data. One study I found where they offered extra credit opportunities to students if they also participated in some discussions about study skills and study habits, specifically for students who were kind of at risk of failing the class. You know, they bombed a test or they missed some assignments. Extra credit is an opportunity to catch up in your grade and avoid failing if you combine that with you know, study skills, time management skills, practicing those kind of things, seeking support and tutoring. And they found that doing that did result in lower failure and dropout rates for those at-risk student populations in the class where they tested this.
Oh, interesting.
Another study, I think this was from an engineering instructor. He found that offering non-punitive, in other words, failing the test did not harm your grade, non-punitive extra credit pop quizzes during his lectures increased attendance of his lectures, which is kind of a no-brainer, right? It makes sense. But he actually did a study and he found evidence that it happened consistently. And then another one that you found that I thought was really interesting. How would you explain their setup for what they were doing?
It was a group of physics instructors, and they were trying to look at whether they could use extra credit to improve how early a student is completing an assignment. So kind of trying to avoid cramming or people turning things in late or right before the deadline, because then you would kind of assume, because of previous research, that they haven't spent a lot of time studying or they're kind of ill prepared for a future assessment. So what they did was they were using Canvas, and they kind of sequenced it so they would have an assignment, and if you completed, these were scaffolded assignments, so it's a big assignment for, say, a module. It's got individual components, and if you complete the individual components by a certain amount of time, it unlocks an extra credit opportunity, which is basically just, did you complete this assignment well before the due date? And what they found was having that kind of, those little incentives made it so that students actually studied for a longer amount of time, and they came back to an assignment multiple times because they had room to essentially start it, put it down, think about it, pick it back up, and that was kind of the theory behind it. And then they were also indicating that with the distribution of scores, they were assuming that both the high-performing students and the low-performing students both took advantage. They didn't really look at how that affected scores specifically, whether it improved student success, but it did indicate, because of a narrowing of the gap between these two groups, that they overall were taking advantage of this resource. So we kind of hear that extra credit might make, and they actually use this term, the richer in a sense in the classroom. The high performing students are the ones that take advantage. But in this case, that's not exactly what they're saying.
Gotcha. Okay, so just quickly, some ideas based on some of the research and readings that we've been doing. Ideas of how should you be framing extra credit. I think it makes sense to use extra credit as an enrichment opportunity and not just a handout of free points, right? And this is kind of what Jennifer was touching on. You're using it to reinforce participation and learning. You're not just using it to inflate your grades artificially. I think for highly motivated students, it's an opportunity to encourage creativity. Tell them, I would like you to go farther than what was the original assignment. You're clearly engaged, interested in this. Go a little farther, dig deeper, try something more creative, take a risk. You're not going to hurt your grade by taking that risk because this is an extra credit opportunity. But it's a way for those high performance, high motivation students to really push themselves. And then for less motivated students, you can use extra credit opportunities to encourage kind of metacognition, thinking about your own thinking process and study process, your academic habits. Post-test reflections are a good form of extra credit. Study guides, gated quiz retakes. In other words, you might give them a chance to retake a quiz to improve their score, but you might put some kind of requirement ahead of it where it's maybe a test reflection of how do you feel like you did on this? And after they've completed the reflection, then you give them a chance to retake the quiz. Or like that study of using extra credit to encourage students to scaffold their own work more effectively here. Turn things in earlier, turn in drafts earlier. The due date is the due date. That is when you really want everything done. But obviously we want students to get working sooner than that. And extra credit is a way of encouraging that. So that's just a little bit of thoughts, some very quick and dirty research that we looked at. Excuse me. You're the one that ate a bunch of food. Now I'm burping.
Making jokes about that earlier, but not to eat before.
Then we wanted to spend a little bit of time looking at some ways to do extra credit in Canvas because it's not incredibly intuitive and there's different ways to do it. The first thing I was going to show is some ways to do extra credit if you are using a points-based grading system. Your whole total grade in the class is 1,000 points or 100 points or however you distribute that. Then it's pretty straightforward to offer clear, understandable extra credit on top of that. So there's a few different options here that I just had some made. Let's look at this one first. Extra credit activity. This is just a normal assignment in Canvas, but the points value is set to 0 on that. So in the grade book, it shows up as 0, which means if a student doesn't complete this extra credit assignment, it's not negatively impacting their overall grade. But if I get into this assignment and I go into SpeedGrader and I look at this a student's work, I can give them points higher than 0. So I might say, for this extra credit activity, if you go and do this thing, I will give you an extra 5 points on top of your grade. And so, for a 500-point total grade book, and that's, half a percentage, about, not a huge amount, but it's easy to calculate for you, fairly easy to calculate for the students. You just give them 5 points and submit, and it goes into the grade book as extra points on top of their existing score. That's pretty straightforward, pretty simple. Another way you can do this is you can add extra credit on top of an existing assignment. So here I have a weekly reflection paper assignment, and I have it set to worth 6 points. The reason I'm using 6 points is because I have a grading rubric attached to this. So maybe I'm grading on writing quality and I'm grading on content. But you can add an extra point to your grading rubric, and that will go above and beyond the actual grade of the assignment and count as extra credit. So in this case, I just have an extra credit criteria in my grading rubric worth an extra point. So potentially a student could earn 7 points instead of 6. And then when I go to the SpeedGrader and I'm grading a student's work, and I click on the rubric, I give them, whatever their score they've earned. but I could also give them the extra credit if they have completed whatever my requirement was for that. And then I hit save, and it goes straight into their grade book. In this case, they missed a point on writing quality, but they earned that extra credit, so it bumps them back up to 6. Or if they did a great job and they got the extra credit, then they earned 7 points out of 6. So it boosted their total grade by 1 point. Do we have some questions in the chat there?
I was just going to say, we had a question. If the 0 does not count for the grade book, how do you set it up so any point that is given does count? And it basically will just, instead of adding, so say I've got a 20 point assignment, 20 out of 20, somebody gets 100% on it. Both the 20 points that I gained will be added to my total, but the 20 points for the total assignment would be given to the actual total in the grade book.
Right.
When we make an activity out of 0, instead of adding to the total, we're just adding to the current points that we have in the grade book.
Yes.
It's kind of a weird way to think
It is,
about
and Jennifer makes a good point. This is not the same as having an ungraded assignment, because when you're making an assignment in Canvas, there's a checkbox that says, is it graded or not graded? If you do not check that, then it's not that it's worth 0 points, it's that it is not connected to the grade book at all. If you check off is graded and you make it worth 0 points, then it shows up as an entry in the grade book, but it says out of 0. So if I don't do it and I score 0 points on it, it is not harming my final total grade. But if I earn extra points on it, then it increases my total grade. Yeah, as like Jennifer said, in this case, if the student doesn't do the work, you just don't enter anything. It shows up as a dash, and it's not really, it's basically just ignored by their final total grade. So that's pretty simple again. Another thing that you can do if you are doing quizzes or tests is you can build extra credit opportunities into a test as well. So I have a super simple 1 question quiz here. So it's 1 question worth 1 point, it's a 1 point quiz. But I also have an extra question worth 0 points. So extra credit bonus question. Now, the downside of doing this is it does mean you have to go in there and manually give the student points for those extra credit questions. So you can't do it automatically. It's not an auto-graded extra credit. But let's go back and speed grader this quiz. So I can see, oh, the student got this wrong, but they did get the extra credit point right. So I can manually give them a point and maybe great job. This right here is a really kind of a dumb example, but something that you could do is have a little reflection question at the end of your quiz. For 3 extra bonus points, tell me how you think you did on this quiz. Did you study enough ahead of time? Did you get enough sleep? Are you hungry? Are you tired? Do you think that you earned the score that you deserve? You can ask those kind of metacognitive questions as a reflection, extra credit question. And then, that's doing 2 things. It's reinforcing those metacognitive skills that we want our students to practice, but it's also giving them an opportunity for extra credit on there. Another thing that you can do on any quiz is this fudge points option, where you can just manually tell Canvas to give a student extra points. I don't love the fudge points because it's not very transparent. It's not entirely clear to the student where those extra points came from. I think it's too easy to accidentally be biased when you're doing fudge points because there's no structure to it. You're just kind of, my gut tells me I'm going to give the student 5 extra points or something. I don't love the fudge points. I prefer having an actual 0 point question in the quiz, and then you can manually give them points for it.
I will say with the fudge points, I mean, I could see it being useful, say, if you tie in your attendance policy to extra credit during quizzes or exams.
Sure.
I've seen that before,
Sure.
But even then, I'd still probably say go with a question built in at 0 points like you've done here. That way, like you said, there's a record too. There's
a record, and if you are going to use fudge points, it's incredibly important to be very transparent about what's happening and why. So that's just something to consider there.
I mean, that's a good rule of thumb for any
It really
extra
is.
credit
It is for all of these, right? Exactly.
That goes without saying.
Okay, so those are really fairly simple ways to do extra credit in Canvas if you are using a points-based system. Now, the tricky part comes if you are using a weighted system. So if I go into my assignments area here, and I have these categories. I have one for homework and one for attendance and one for my final project. And right now it's just a points-based system. I just give points to things. There's a total point value at the end of the course, and that's how their grade is calculated. But you can also do a weighted system where maybe I say, well, my homework assignments are going to be 30% of your final grade. My attendance is 50, my final project is 20. And I'm doing this weighted system. Now, there are some advantages to a weighted system in some circumstances, especially if it's a case where maybe you have reflection papers or discussion posts or something, and you're not 100% sure how many of those activities you're going to get to in a quarter, then a weighted system gives you a lot of flexibility. I don't know if I'm going to have 8 discussions or 10 discussions this quarter. I'm not quite sure what we're going to get to, but I know that I want 30% of my total grade to come from the discussions. So the weighted system makes it fairly easy and intuitive to do that. But when it comes to extra credit, the weighted system throws us all out of balance and makes it very confusing and unintuitive if you are doing extra credit in the way that we just showed. Because, for example, I'm just trying to think of a good example here, Nick, help me out. That extra credit weekly reflection with extra credit option. So it's worth 6 points, but let's say a student earns 7 points on it. But it's in this category of homework assignments, which is worth 30% of my total grade. Now I have to really try to figure out, well, so that 1 point isn't 1%, it's something else. I would have to calculate how many total points are there in this category, and then multiply that by 0.3 to get the 30%.
I think somebody better at math than us could tell you exactly how to figure out the actual value of what it has.
But also then if I go in here and add another homework assignment that wasn't there before, then it changes that calculation. And now that extra point of extra credit is now worth less than it was a second ago. So it's very confusing. It's confusing enough for us as instructional designers to figure out how the calculation is working. It's going to be incredibly confusing to the students. Yeah. So here is what I have found to be the easiest solution to this problem for extra credit in a weighted system. And Jerry, please jump in if I'm way off base with some of this, but this was a technique that I found online that I thought was pretty clever. So right now I have a set of categories totaling 100%, my assignment groups. I'm going to make an extra group. We're going to call it extra credit. And I'm going to make that worth 100% of the total grade. So right now, my grade book goes up to 200%, right? The reason I would want to do this is if I make an assignment, an extra credit assignment, and I make it worth 1 point, and it's in that 100 per, wait, am I doing that right?
I think so far. I mean, we'll find out when it gets in.
I might have just did that wrong. If I do that, then
wouldn't you do it out of 100, right? And then it would be 1 point, and 1 point would actually equal 1 point.
Say that again.
So you were saying that we had 100% for this category,
right?
And then wasn't it you make the extra credit out of 100 and give 1 point to it?
That's right. That's right. So we make this
some weird maths going on here.
Worth 100 points, up to 100 points. Okay, that's right. Now, if I go into the grade book, I hope we're doing this right. We'll see.
So we'll find out.
So I have this student with the extra credit out of 100. And let's say that I've given them an assignment worth 5 points of extra credit. Or what I want it to be is worth 5% of their total extra credit, right?
Yes. So
let's say I want to make a 5%.
I think we're onto it.
Oops. Then I would give them 5 points in that extra credit category. And then that will automatically add 5% on top of their existing grade. I think we got there.
We'll see.
It's confusing and a little unintuitive, but by having that extra category worth an extra 100%, any point that you add to it is going to basically act as a percent on their total grade. Now, one potential downside to this is going back to my assignment categories.
Aside from being
confusing, which it is.
Make sure you put the right numbers in there.
The other thing I have to make sure that I do is you need to have at least one graded assignment in each graded category before you assign any point value here. Otherwise, it's still going to screw up their final grade calculation because it's the grade book is looking at this 100% and this 30%, but it's not including this 50 or this 20 because there are no graded assignments in there. Students haven't earned any grades in there. So Canvas is still trying to do its best to give them a percentage, and it's not going to be accurate. Mm-hmm. So if you are using this technique, you have to have at least one grade entered in each category before you start giving them extra credit. That is super confusing. And then Jennifer adds another great question. How does this method change the what if function? And in a weighted gradebook, I'm not entirely sure. It probably throws that way out of balance.
Potentially.
Yeah.
Well, I guess the what if grade at the assignment level probably would be the same if they're doing it, say, in the assignments category. But I imagine some students kind of factoring in extra credit. Somebody might put something in there and totally throw their grade off. And
yeah.
I could see that becoming a confusing element, which would require some.
Yes. So I think the point here is if you are using a weighted gradebook system, it is very confusing to do extra credit in a way that is transparent to both you and to the student.
Yeah.
So I tried to explain this simple workaround, and it's still super confusing, and it still has weird corner cases to it. So I guess the take home here would be if you're doing a weighted gradebook system and you want to do extra credit, maybe come talk to us and we'll work through a solution that works for you because it is not intuitive. If you're using a points-based system, not a weighted one, it is fairly straightforward, pretty simple. It's just points. Weighted system, confusing and weird and needs some massaging and some experimentation.
And I'm sure somebody might say, well, why don't you just add, a point to an assignment like standard? But then just remember, because those points aren't going to equal 1 point at the end of the day, which might make it difficult.
Those points don't equal 1% necessarily.
Yeah. So, or the same percent at any given time.
Right. So hopefully this was helpful.
Hopefully that was less confusing.
I think everything is not too confusing except for the weighted gradebook system. That's just unfortunately the way the weighted system works. The benefit of a weighted gradebook is flexibility. The disadvantage of a weighted system is the way those calculations are made is not incredibly clear to the student or to the instructor. Well, we're at our time limit here. But don't need to go anywhere for about 15 minutes or so. So if anybody has any questions or extra credit activities that you have done that have either worked well or haven't worked well and you want to share with us, happy to hear it. And if not, that is fine too.
I'm going to interject here real quick on that. One of the things that I've seen on that, when you got weighted average, when you got the weighted groups, and you got extra credit, explain that to your students. Be clear how that extra credit is calculated so that they don't get confused and think, oh, I'm going to get 100 points of extra credit, or,
right.
It's very confusing. So it's that weighted, if you used weighted groups, don't use extra credit.
That kind of seems like part of the answer here is,
Yeah,
yeah.
but explain it, but if you do explain it to your students how it's going to be calculated, and then there should be no confusions at the end of the, and especially if they use the what if grades too.
Yeah, I think if you're using a weighted system and you want to offer some sort of extra credit, maybe the easier solution is allowing resubmissions or retakes of a quiz or of an assignment. Because you're giving them a chance to earn a higher grade on something they've already completed, but it doesn't completely throw your grade book out of whack.
Yeah.
That I think is the more straightforward way to offer extra credit in a weighted system.
Mm-hmm. The KISS principles. Keep it simple, silly. We'll say that. Keep it simple, silly.
All right. Well, thank you everybody for coming today. Jerry, I appreciate the input there. Yeah, even Jerry agrees that the weighted system is confusing. So that tells you how confusing it is. Join us next week for another Tech Talk. What is our topic next week?
I think next week is accordions or the concept of controlling the flow of content for a reader in a Canvas page. So we'll be taking a look at some code options.
Super simple.
Around, yeah.
You don't need to know a ton of code to do it.
That's the beauty, right?
Yeah, it's very easy to implement, and the result looks nice, and it's a great way to organize and control information.
Yeah.
So we will talk about that next week. Thanks for coming. Talk to y'all later.
Have a good one.
And stream is ended.